Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our speaker and our chair have just arrived. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the 16th India Policy Forum lecture. I guess once you cross 15, then there's perhaps hope for anybody who's past their teens, right? So we're delighted to have Professor Stan Fischer, former vice chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve of the United States, with us, and Mr. N.K. Singh, who needs no introduction to this audience, but currently the chairperson or the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission, who is going to chair the proceedings. They are busily catching up, they're old friends, so this is really a wonderful circling back. As those of you who were here yesterday heard me say, this is a circling back of another type as well, since Stan Fischer was our first IPF guest speaker in 2004. So Stan, we are delighted that you are back again. And at that point, I guess you hadn't joined the Federal Reserve and you hadn't joined the Bank of Israel. So there were a lot of things that happened. So let me first introduce Stan Fischer, and then I'll say a few words about our chairperson, and then invite them to the stage. Stan Fischer was, as I said, was the vice chair till October 2017 under President Obama of the Board of Governors of the U.S. Federal Reserve, and he served, of course, with Janet Yellen. He was earlier the governor of the Bank of Israel, vice chairman of Citigroup, the first deputy managing director of the IMF, and chief economist of the World Bank. That's the job in which I was hired in his vice presidency. And one of the things we did together was to start the annual bank conference on development economics. And the nicest part about that was the name ABCDE, which made it really simple for everybody to remember it. And Stan and I had the great pleasure of working together and producing the first few proceedings volumes of that conference. Stan was also the Elizabeth and James Killian class of 1926 professor of economics at MIT, earlier an associate professor there, and before that an assistant professor at the University of Chicago. Stan has been a fellow of the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Econometric Society, and a research associate at NBER. He's been an honorary fellow at the London School of Economics as well. As we all know, he's published extensively in macro and monetary economics, and has, of course, been a forceful voice in these areas in global economic policy. Stan received his BSc and MSc in economics from LSE, and of course has long friends, Indian friends from those years that he has kept up with. So we are delighted to have him. Stan, would you please come to the podium? NK, why don't you also come? And as you are coming, I'm going to introduce you. N.K. Singh, of course, as I said, needs no introduction. Currently chairman of the 15th Finance Commission at a very crucial point in time in state and federal relationships because of the GST and a range of other things that are happening. N.K. Singh, of course, has served on the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs and the Committee on Local Area Development Schemes, a large number of those schemes, and is, of course, a member of the Bharatiya Janata Party, and has been very active both as a civil servant and, of course, as a chair of many committees, including the FRBM committee that really looked at the FRBM situation. We're delighted to have both of them, and I'm going to hand over to N.K. Singh to conduct the proceedings. N.K.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shekhar. It's indeed a privilege for me to chair this lecture we are all waiting for by you by Stanley Fischer. He's chosen to speak, I believe, on the issue of macroeconomic policy and some variations of that. Don't want to, of course, prejudge what he wants to say, but many of these issues really are of great contemporary relevance, not only globally, but many of these issues are currently engaging the attention of Indian policy makers. Many fixed paradigms on macro policies are being increasingly questioned on the extent to which they foster growth while ensuring macroeconomic stability. So I think that I'm now going to really request you, Stan, to give you a lecture, and thereafter you have kindly agreed to have a Q&A session to which we also greatly look forward to. Stan.
Well, thanks very much both to Shekhar Shah and to N.K. Singh. I used to know Shekhar in the World Bank over 40 years ago, almost. And I used to meet N.K. both in India and at Davos, where he put on the best dinner parties. And there was an official party before his, and then you all sneaked out of the official party and went off to the N.K. Singh real party. I have to say that looking at N.K. and myself up on the stage, I was reminded of the things I wanted to do in the Bank of Israel. I wrote a list of 15 goals before we got there. And one of the goals was improving the quality of the dress worn in the Bank of Israel. Well, I made about 12 out of 15. This was not one of them. When I arrived, there were 2 people wearing ties. When I left, there were 5. It only took 8 years. I could have made it, I think, if I'd only persisted longer. Anyway, it is very good to be back in India. It's very kind of you to invite me to do this lecture for a second time. And it's very, very pleasant indeed to meet old friends. I recognize all the faces, I think. I'm not as good on the names as I used to be, but we can deal with that by talking to each other. What one does see, I think, and I didn't read Indian, when I was in the World Bank and particularly in the IMF, I was in India quite often, and then I also came for Citigroup several times. And what I see in the years that has happened since then is serious progress in many areas, with a very high quality of research. Policy research is harder to do than straightforward theoretical research, because you have to actually understand the institutional structure if you're going to pronounce on what should be done in a country. And we had some of that this morning in that discussion, and I think Rakesh mentioned it a few times about the institutional structure. And then, of course, one wonders, where does this all end up? Well, it won't end up, it'll keep going. And of course, one of the prime problems to be dealt with is the data problem. I thought we had a wonderful session this morning. It really should have been made into a movie, because it started with 3 perfectly sensible speeches. Each person spoke quietly, accurately, and with moderation. Then the floor opened to questions, and there were 2 or 3 questions which were asked without any evident irritation. but the irritation level kept going up, and in the end you just had a sort of noise coming out of the audience. And I thought it would make a very nice movie. So I suggest you do it. Didn't you? Somebody say they wanted it in 6 months' time? This morning, I think somebody wanted to have it again in 6 months' time. Well, move along with the movie version. I want to talk about macroeconomic stabilization policy, and that'll be 2/3 of what I talk about. And then I've got something that came to me as I was reading the literature, because when I started preparing for this lecture, I called Shekhar and said, you know, Shekhar, I don't know the literature as well as I used to, and I haven't kept up with knowing about India in the way I knew it when I was responsible for India in the IMF. And he kindly agreed to send me newspaper clippings and so forth. And I got a lot of them, and I looked at them, and it's impressive, the range of issues, of economic issues, which are handled seriously by columnists in the newspapers. And one of them particularly caught my eye, and I'll come to that at the end. The lecture I'm mainly going to give, I've called Macroeconomic Stabilization Policy, is about changes that are taking place now in the macroeconomic field. The Great Depression gave birth to Keynesian economics, and for a long time many of us were Keynesians. I still think I am. We may well now be in a period in which macroeconomic stabilization is changing. Many of us may become something else. What would they be? I can't figure out how to make these words into nouns, but I think we could be Summersians, that's Larry, Blanchardians, that's Olivier Blanchard, Woodfordians, that's Michael, and so forth. But we're not there yet. We're still trying to figure out what we think. And this is a good time to ask where we're going macroeconomically. So I want to start by asking what is causing many macroeconomists to believe we need a new approach to thinking about macro stabilization policies. And I'll start with the fact that the global economy looks very different than it did 15 years ago. And I want to start by focusing on difficulties confronting monetary policy, and I'll start by talking mostly about the United States economy. Relative to, say, 20 years ago, I'll give you numbers. Number one, relative to, say, 20 years ago, we now have very low interest rates in almost all the advanced economies. This is the essential element in secular stagnation, which, sorry about that. This is the essential element in secular stagnation, which, on the back of which Larry Summers launched a series of papers to discuss what we should be doing now. Almost everywhere, the inflation rate is very low. That's 2. And in many inflation targeting countries, the inflation rate is below target, which is usually 2% in the OECD countries. 3, in several countries, the nominal interest rate is below 0 and has been below 0 for a few years. In other words, in those countries, the zero lower bound has become what is now called the effective lower bound. And point 4, in terms of acronyms, we've moved from, now I'm in trouble, it's either the ZLB or the ZLB, the zero lower bound on the policy interest rate, we've moved from that to the ELB, the effective lower bound. The United States avoided reaching the ZLB on the nominal interest rate in the Great Depression, in the financial recession, but we were certainly concerned that that might happen. We're at 0.5. No country has yet set its short-term interest rate, policy interest rate, below -1%. So long as we're using currency, we will not be able to set the nominal interest rate at exceptionally, that is even more exceptionally, low levels. 0.6. In the United States and in several other countries, the actual inflation rate has been below the target inflation rate for most of the period since 2010. This could lead to a situation in which the public begins to expect that the actual inflation rate will be below the target inflation rate in the future, perhaps for a long time. John Williams, the president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, has been very worried about this phenomenon. He's emphasized its dangers, for he sees a situation in which pessimistic expectations could lead the inflation rate to continue declining until it hits the effective lower bound. The Fed's concerns about the gap between the target inflation rate and the actual inflation rate have led it to undertake a set of meetings with economists from outside the Fed for advice on how better to conduct monetary policy. This series of meetings is called, quotation marks, Fed Listens, and its most visible meeting was held at the Chicago Fed at the beginning of June, the June we just left behind. Now, what is going to come out of this? Well, many people are very worried about the very low inflation rate and the fact that it cannot seem to get itself up to the level of the target inflation rate, or to put it differently, the target inflation rate seems higher than the natural inflation rate, if there is such a thing. So what is going to come out of this? Well, if you're an Australian, you'll say, well, you should do what we've been doing for the last 25 years, which is basically they target the average inflation rate. And if it's more or less at 2% over a period of years or something like that, they're happy with that, and they're not particularly interested in being precisely at 2% all the time. Now, if the Fed sets the inflation rate, if you say we're going to try to set if the Fed is setting a target rate of inflation for each period such that the average will be equal to the target inflation rate for long periods, we're going to have a very different, and I think a very difficult, monetary policy to follow. Because in some periods, the Fed's target inflation rate, short term, would be above the long-term inflation rate. That's if previously you were below the average. And sometimes below the target inflation rate. That's if previously you were above the economy was above the average, the target inflation rate. This sounds very simple, but this also has very interesting dynamics, which I think are a problem, because the likelihood of the dynamics is that the inflation rate may well be negatively autocorrelated. As if you have a low inflation rate, you've got to have a higher one next time, or at least for some period ahead. And if you've had too high an inflation rate, you've got to have a lower one for some time. And I think that may be very confusing, and certainly in terms of what the term structure of interest rates should look like, it will look very different, because currently people think you're going monotonically towards a long-term target, and that is not what would happen in this case. Now, there is another set of approaches, which, say, Olivier Blanchard may be the most prominent exponent, which says we should just forget about 2% inflation targets and move to 4%. And then we'll have more room to deal with the danger of a zero or negative interest rate, and it will be a much easier target to attain. I actually think that's a mistake. Olivier is certainly among my best, very best students, so I don't say that to say that everybody should understand that he's wrong. It's not clear that everybody should understand that he's wrong. But I don't think you can move the inflation target from 2% to 4% without making a lot of other changes. In particular, you're almost certainly going to have indexation introduced in various parts of the economy, because 4% is not 2%. It's a high number, and in 10 years you'll lose more than half the value of your investment if you're making 4% and the inflation rate is prices are constant. So I rule that out. The Fed has told people who are going to advise it that they should rule that out, because they don't have any intention of moving to a target inflation rate, to a higher target inflation rate. Well, the question of how to do this technically is besetting a lot of people now, and Ben Bernanke in particular has been writing a sequence of papers which in effect, not what he says, what in effect seeks to come close to the simplicity of the inflation targeting approach for monetary policy, with which the Fed and other central banks set out on their inflation targeting monetary policy in the late 20th century. It was very simple. Every period you aim to hit your target, 2%. Bygones are bygones. What the approach of trying to get the average inflation rate right says is that bygones are not bygones, and that you have to make it up. And Ben has a paper called, it's a recent paper, Evaluating Lower for Longer Policies, Temporary Price Level Targeting. But his argument is, if you're above or below the average, just have the keep the price level constant, and you'll converge to the average of whatever it is you want. Ben's is complicated, and I think that we lose the advantage of what we have now, which is, I think, the first time in history that among the industrialized countries there is an actual agreement about what the price level, what the inflation rate should be. If you look at every major country, its target inflation rate is 2%. And that, I think, is a stabilizing element. If we start having this country doing that and that country doing this, we're certainly going to have more inflation, more exchange rate variability than we have now, because the exchange rates will have to adapt themselves. So I'm more skeptical about these things than my colleagues, and of course they're very polite. They don't tell me, listen, you're older than we are, forget about it. But that's the way I at least feel about what is going on. in the field at the moment on monetary policies. Now, I also want to turn to fiscal policy because there are also changes in fiscal policy. But before doing that, I want to make a few comments, particularly on financial sector supervision and regulation. And I will, you should hold your chair tightly, I will discuss whether a central bank needs capital. But I will not take a strong stand because I don't want to be thrown out. So let me start on financial sector supervision and regulation. Consider the following questions. Should bank supervision be carried out only by the central bank? And the other question, what about supervision of the non-bank financial system? In whose hands should that be placed? Well, with regard to bank supervision, countries have different supervisory and institutional histories. Most of Latin America have central banks designed by one man, Camara, who in the 1920s traveled through Latin America, giving each of them the need for a very stately building. They all have very stately buildings, and a structure which made some sense at the time. So they fundamentally have the supervision separate from the central bank. So my view is one needs occasionally to be pragmatic, and countries just have different supervisory and institutional histories. And if the existing arrangements have stood the tests of time and the tests of financial distress, there is no overwhelming reason either to remove bank supervision from the control of the central bank, if that's where it is, or to move it from being outside the central bank to being inside the central bank. So I think there's not much in it, but I should note that the Bank of England appeared to be happy in 1997 when control over bank supervision was taken away from it, when it achieved monetary policy independence in 1997. And it seemed, but then it seemed once again to be happy when control over bank supervision was returned to it after the start of the great financial crisis, which henceforth will be called the GFC. So, having seen what it was like not to be the supervisor of the entire system, the Bank of England at least chose, given the choice, to go back to having full control over the entire system. There is, however you do it, there is these institutional arrangements have to do one thing well, and it is that the supervisors of the banks should have full confidence that the supervisors of the other units are doing their jobs well, and vice versa, and that they will be able to coordinate with each other if and when the time comes that coordination is needed. And that is the essential requirement of the structure that is set up to regulate the financial system. Second issue about regulation and supervision is the role of the lender of last resort, henceforth the LOLR. Every industry has its acronyms, and you just have to get used to them. That's all one can say. Badgett, by the way, managed to write a whole book without knowing the words LOLR. I mean the acronym LOLR, and it seemed to be pretty successful. So there are two approaches to the role of the LOLR. One, it should exist, and two, it shouldn't exist. So consider the difference between the approaches to the lender of last resort taken in the US and UK, respectively, after the start of the great financial crisis. In the US, the Dodd-Frank law curtailed the lender of last resort role of the Fed. Certain powers of the Fed were taken away. Now, that is a problem. The Fed is not allowed to do certain varieties of things which would otherwise have been part of loans that it would have made in the context of of dealing with a crisis. So the Dodd-Frank law curtailed the Fed's lender of last resort role. Post-crisis legal reforms in the UK sought to ensure that a potential financial panic originating in any part of the financial system would have access somehow to a lender of last resort in the event it was needed. So they did not reject the use of a lender of last resort. I believe the British approach is preferable, and let me explain why. The moral hazard argument suggesting that the lender of last resort is a major danger is, to my mind, exaggerated. The argument says that making a lender of last resort available to any part of the financial system creates moral hazard. But the existence of moral hazard is something that exists any time there's a guarantee facility anywhere about anything. So it's not something which says you shouldn't put mechanisms to deal with the crises which may happen in place. The argument is that managers of money will take excessive risks if they know they might be bailed out in a crisis. And, well, they might take excessive risks. But let me just describe the situation to explain why I think that we exaggerate about the importance of moral hazard in the lender of last resort. Now, this is a real live situation that happened. It's the situation the IMF faced in 1998 when it agreed to make a large loan to Korea, which was $60 billion. It was the largest loan that had at that stage been made to any country in a financial crisis. It was making that loan to try to moderate the damage done to Korean people by the recession it was already beginning to suffer. I was asked at Jackson Hole why we were making the loan to Korea and not instead using those resources to lend to needy African countries. My answer was, first, the Korean government have already told us what changes they will make in their economy so that this will not happen again. We believed them, and we were right to believe them. Second, Koreans were already donating serious amounts of their gold to of their personal holdings of gold to their government to help it deal with the crisis. And third, a question I put to my interrogator, and this is the essence of why I think this lender of last resort is too facile. I said to the person, he's a well-known person, but I won't get into a personal argument here. It would be unfashionable. You want us to punish 30 million Korean citizens so that they won't do this again. Who is they? They who caused the crisis were probably some members of the cabinet of the Korean government and other major institutions like the central bank, and perhaps 10,000 bankers and others in the private sector. They have already almost all lost their jobs. Some of them will get new jobs, many of them will retire. What will they have learned, and what will they do with it? Well, they probably won't have much opportunity to do anything with it. And what will be remembered after those bankers pass from the scene? What will future bankers and supervisors have learned from the fact that Korea had a deeper recession than was necessary? The only thing I think I can say definitely is the conclusion to draw is that central bankers are sadists. They're imposing a deep crisis on Korea so that somebody won't do it again, whoever somebody may be. And I don't find this impressive. Furthermore, I don't see any way of getting rid of it, because in the United States already the tightening of capital requirements and other things designed to prevent the future crises are being shifted back, are being reduced capital requirements. And there's no major outcry about the fact that we're increasing the riskiness of using the lender of last resort. I'd like to say one more thing about the great financial crisis. The people who caused the great financial crisis were not only the bankers, but also the regulators and supervisors who in effect, allowed the risks taken by sophisticated bankers and non-bankers with their derivatives and other fancy financial instruments to do the damage they did. And so it is, to me, somewhat of a mystery that the major changes in regulations that were made after the great financial crisis all had to do with the behavior of the banking system. There was a little bit of it which was related to stress tests and so on that I think is very useful. So now I want to turn to monetary policy, and I guess I've got to look at my watch, yes. Thus far, my focus has been on monetary policy. I do not go into what is likely to happen, except in this discussion of the lender of last resort, as a result of the measures taken following the crisis of 10 years ago. So I focused on monetary policy. When we were younger, in my case, it was reading Samuelson's Economics, 5th edition. We talked about both monetary and fiscal policy. And the chapter on stabilization had monetary policy on one curve and fiscal policy on the other. And you moved them around in what someone once called, in a nice comment on a paper of Rudy Dornbusch's, he said, this is a Dornbusch diagram. It's got one line that goes up and one that goes across, and they intersect, and you have to know why they intersect, where they intersected. So that was the sort of thing we did, and we had reasonable things to say about both monetary and fiscal policy. There's been at least one important development with respect to fiscal policy as a tool of macro stabilization. Olivier Blanchard's presidential address to the AEA, Public Debt and Low Interest Rates, starts with a one-page summary in which Olivier develops the points that he makes in this speech, which has received a lot of attention. It's in, I think, the May edition of the 2019 American Economic Review. So I'll follow another set of numbers. These are not additions to the ones in the first part of the paper. 1, these are Olivier's points. In the current United States situation, safe interest rates are expected to remain below growth rates for a long time. And here I'm quoting Olivier, put bluntly, public debt may have no fiscal cost. What does that mean? It means that government borrowing invested successfully may not increase future budget deficits. Why not? Because the investment will produce the profits that enable the government to pay the enable the government to pay off the debt that it incurred, or the amount of debt that is attributed to that period. This is like the golden rule of capital accumulation, but it's not exactly the same statement. Second, this is Olivier again. Public debt reduces capital accumulation and may therefore have welfare costs, but those costs may be smaller than typically assumed. quote, "The reason is that the safe rate is the risk-adjusted rate of return on capital." That's an interesting comment. It means that the more uncertain is the rate of interest, the bigger the reduction you can make on it to calculate what the safe rate equivalent of that interest rate is. And I'd always thought that however you introduced uncertainty, it would raise the required return. And when you look at real rates of return, Olivier correctly points out that it wouldn't. He also discusses a number of arguments against high public debt, and in particular the existence of multiple equilibria, where investors believe debt to be risky, and by requiring a risk premium, increase the fiscal burden and make debt effectively riskier. Olivier says this is a very relevant argument, but it does not have straightforward implications for the appropriate level of debt. That means he's not disagreeing that it might have implications for the appropriate level of debt. He also says, "My purpose in the lecture is not to argue for more public debt, especially in the current political environment. It is to have a richer discussion of the cost of debt and of fiscal policy than is currently the case." Bottom line, Olivier makes a good case that what our grandparents told us about the dangers of deficit finance may well have been exaggerated. It's a good case, but it's not one that fills me with either joy or conviction. I've seen too many countries unable to access capital markets, thus needing an IMF program, to believe that we should pay major attention to the argument that we should all be less anti-debt than we have been so far. But science is science, so we shall proceed. Where does all this leave us? I'm going to make, well, I won't give you the numbers of these points, but I'm going to make a series of points. First, I did not discuss the new modes of monetary policy that were used in the global financial crisis. But if we're thinking of stabilization policy, the evidence is that central banks have more instruments that can be used to encourage economic activity than we thought 10 years ago. And these instruments can and have worked. Secondly, we should remember that fiscal policy is possible, and that when the interest rate is lower than the marginal product of investment, it makes sense to use an active fiscal policy to encourage economic activity. And further, even if the marginal product of some investments is lower than the interest rate, there may well be other investments that the government should be making. And I will even admit on discussing this point that deficit financing may be a little less dangerous than I used to think. But that does not mean that projects should be sloppily built or that projects should be made more expensive than is necessary. Public sector officials should treat the dollars or rupees they control with as much care as they treat their personal spending. In fact, most often they should treat the public's money with even more care than they treat their own money. Some years ago, Alan Blinder suggested that the US should develop a fiscal agency, that it would eventually be to fiscal policy what the Fed is to monetary policy. That is, a group of experts, etc., sitting around deciding how much, let's say, infrastructure development a country should overtake. The problem with that is that governing is in large part about what the representatives of the public spend in legislatures, spend public money on. And so politicians have not jumped to implement the fisc, as it would probably be called. But there does remain a serious set of questions about why, so far, we hear talk about major fiscal actions, particularly infrastructure, then we see actions that undertake the creation of infrastructure. And furthermore, there are many fiscal actions that would make sense to anybody with some sense. Now, I'm turning next, eventually, to the second part of the lecture, in which the focus is on India. India has a 6-person monetary committee with 3 members from the RBI and 3 from the government. Inflation targeting was introduced after the monetary committee was set up in 2015. The governor of the RBI is chairman of the monetary committee and has a double vote that he or she may use in the event that the committee's vote is tied. The RBI is an inflation targeter with only a one-variable mandate, inflation. The Fed has its famous dual mandate to maintain price stability and to achieve full employment. Does the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, actually take both targets into account? I want to say something briefly about dual mandates. With regard to the dual mandate, it is sometimes said that the central bank needs as many instruments of policy as it has targets. This is a result obtained in the 1950s, I think, by Jan Tinbergen, a Dutchman, one of the first winners of the Nobel Prize in economics. Now, what he shows is if the central bank is required to meet 2 targets exactly, it will need 2 instruments. That's a true theorem. But if you're a microeconomist, you know that optimization is about trade-offs, and that given a utility function with however many arguments in it, or a loss function with many arguments, there is usually an optimum composite target for the optimizer to attempt to achieve, given the tools that he or she has available. And there's no need for there to be an equal number of targets and instruments. And the Fed doesn't have separate instruments devoted to output and to inflation. So to be able to do what it's doing, the Fed has to carry over the flexibility of the flexible inflation targeting approach to the dual mandate. That is to say that while the 2% per annum inflation target is both measurable and measured, the rate of unemployment is taken into account flexibly. The June unemployment rate in the United States, announced last Friday, was 3.7%. This, in terms of the data the Fed has published, was clearly an overachievement of the full employment target, for in the summary of economic projections, the famous dot plots, the median estimate of the long-run unemployment rate was 4.2%, which is to say that the Fed is operating with an inflation rate that is too low and with an unemployment rate that is too low. Now, is the FOMC doing anything special to deal with excessive employment? Not much. When one asks how the economy reaches a balance between its inflation and unemployment targets, the answer some decades ago would have been about the shape of the long-run Phillips curve. At present, with inflation being below target, or with both variables being below target, or below or above, I'm not sure which direction we're measuring, both targets are in some sense overperforming. But while major efforts are being made to get inflation to rise, no major effort is being made to increase unemployment. At some point, we will need to investigate the shape of the unemployment loss function more seriously. For example, would we really object if the inflation rate rose to the targeted 2%, while unemployment remained below 4%? I wouldn't object, which means we, or at least I, need to think harder about exactly what level of unemployment we want to call U star. What about the RBI? Does it actually worry about the level of unemployment? I'm not sure that it would worry. I have not interrogated anybody, so let me just say what I think. I'm not sure that it would greatly worry about lower unemployment. I am sure the RBI would worry about higher unemployment, for the public and the government worry about high unemployment. which means there is less difference between having a single inflation target and a dual inflation unemployment mandate than one would think when first hearing about the different mandates. In the 1970s, I actually tried to reconstruct what the utility functions must be of the Bank of England, the Fed, and the Bundesbank based on what they had done. And there was no appreciable difference in the way they reacted to inflation and unemployment, whether they did or they didn't have, the Fed did have the dual mandate. There are several other actions that the Indian government has undertaken in recent years that deserve comment and in most cases commendation. The first is the agreement on a national goods and services tax. This would be a major achievement in any country. It is an amazing achievement in a 29-state, 1.3 billion people country. Second, the creation of Aadhaar numbers for over 1 billion people starting in January 2012 is another major achievement. No less impressive is the fact that within 2.5 years of the opening of the so-called, I have to say it in English, I'm sorry, PMDJY bank accounts, there were over 200 million of these accounts with an average balance of over 200 rupees per account. Now I have to confess I was meant to show you some slides about the Indian economy, which I'm going to skip in the interests of time. But I do want to show you what happened. I don't know how big that is. Oh, it's not there. No, here it is. Okay. This is the dynamics of what happened after the financial changes were put in place. And what you see is really remarkably rapid impact of the creation of the PMDJY accounts, and that was the banks were required to go out and get those accounts opened, and they did it, and it is a major achievement. There is, third, the mystery of the demonetization of 500 and 1,000 rupee banknotes, whose removal reduced the nominal value of currency in circulation by over 80%. The demonetization did cause a recession, but far less serious a recession than most had predicted, and it very likely had positive effects. Fourth, throughout the period since the 1991 crisis of the Indian economy, India's trade regime has become gradually more liberal, not at the end. In fact, if I go back quickly enough, we'll see where is it? Let me go forward. Somewhere we will see, well, we don't. Sorry about that, I thought we did. But you see here the continuing devaluation of the Indian rupee, which is a success for the Indian economy in all likelihood. And now I say that India's trade regime has gradually become more liberal, and since then the country has avoided external crises, including during the Asian crises of 1997, 1998. That was a major achievement. And what India's approach, cautious approach to foreign exchange liberalization, India's approach appears to have paid off. Of course, it would be difficult to prove that the liberalization was slower than optimal, but that might have been the case. So let me penultimately mention two more complicated issues before concluding with a puzzling question. Issue one, central bank capital. I shall step cautiously. In his interesting book Of Counsel, Arvind Subramanian referred to me as a legend. This could be a compliment. It could also be a statement that I do not exist. Once I figured out what it is, I'll let you know, provided I exist. The only proof of my existence that I can present, and I'm doing this just to mention the name of one of my great teachers, Paul Samuelson, the only proof of my existence I can present is cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Well, at least I think so. If I may, I would also like to mention the question Samuelson asked after someone in the class had quoted. You can see the economics was very cultural in MIT. Someone else had quoted cogito ergo sum, and Samuelson said, by the way, where did he find the second O in cogito? That's an exam question. Arvind was kindly pointing out in what he said about me that during most of the 8 years I was governor of the Bank of Israel had negative capital. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but I think it was because the shekel had appreciated against the dollar following its 1985 stabilization program. And there's a problem with the what is the numeraire for reserves? Because in the current setup, if you measure just the shekel value of the reserves and you're holding dollars and the currency is depreciating, your reserves are going up. And this is kind of counterintuitive. So there is a problem, and I think that's what accounted for that fact. But we should recognize that there are no well-agreed principles for deciding how large are the foreign reserves a central bank should hold, nor are there well-agreed principles for deciding how increases in the value of reserves should accrue to the central bank and the Treasury, respectively. Of course, the central bank law should clarify how much of the profits, if any, the central bank should be authorized to keep. But the central bank would no doubt justifiably prefer to be in a position in which it would have immediate access to the reserves it would need to stabilize a financial crisis. And if the Treasury and the central bank are asking what the right answer is, they would set up a working group to find an agreed answer. Finally, we come to some central bank independence. Some countries have very strong laws protecting the independence of the central bank. For example, Germany and the Bundesbank, or the members of the European Monetary Union. Other central banks may be subject to laws that appear to be strong, but have serious weaknesses. For instance, consider a country that has a 7-member monetary committee, but 3 slots on the committee are vacant, and the chair has already served 2 of the 4 years that constitute his term as a chair. Further, in current circumstances, the appointments to the monetary committee can be, I say this almost literally, can be made by the head of government. This is a central bank whose independence is not fully guaranteed. Now I want to conclude with a question, and it's on a totally different subject, and it comes from my reading the material that Shaker was trying to get me to read to understand the Indian economy. I was impressed reading those the material that was sent to me fairly regularly by what India had achieved in the time I wasn't following events closely. I was impressed too that some of the problems from which the Indian economy had suffered 20 years ago were still major obstacles to reaching closer to its potential. So let me conclude with a question that is also a challenge. It comes from a column by Shankar Acharya, published in the Business Standard on December the 13th, 2018, called, and once I say it you'll understand where I'm going, called Education, the Continuing Tragedy. Shankar writes, "We have failed miserably in achieving halfway decent outcomes in our schools. And what is truly tragic is that no significant improvements seem to be underway. He concludes his column with a powerful sentence that is supported by the data he presents in his column. And here it is: without serious and systemic education reforms by the central and state governments, the future looks dark. My question: how can a country that has mastered modern technology, as well as India has demonstrated in some of the reforms in the financial sector, of which I've just spoken, how can that also be a country in which the average reading level of children in rural schools in the 5th grade, and that's more than 50% of the students, is at the level of reading required of students in the 2nd grade? Well, thank you very much. It has always been a pleasure visiting India, and it remains a pleasure. Thank you. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Stan, for a lecture which spans over many complex issues of monetary policy, issues of what happened during the global financial crisis, and going on to fiscal crisis, and then on your comments on the Indian situation, including some of the current issues which the central bank is facing. So that was really a masterly overview. And I will now seek from the audience who would like to ask the first question. You, Rakesh, I would like to ask the first question.
Also on you obviously mentioned the single target or the dual regime of the Federal Reserve. As for the Federal Reserve has now also added the third, as the Bank of England, which is financial stability.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering how come you didn't mention that, because as far as I understand, one of the consequences of the North Atlantic financial crisis has been the addition of financial stability as one of the objectives of central banks.
Yeah, well, the longer version of this paper contains a discussion of where supervision of the financial system should be. And it goes beyond what I said in the lecture itself. That financial supervision can be done separately if there is somebody or some group that is looking at the system as a whole. And in the United States, we have the Financial Stability, what have you, I don't quite remember, Oversight Council, the FSOC, and they get together. But there is no executive power in that committee, except the Treasury, and the Treasury doesn't have the right to order the supervisory agencies around. I'm sorry, I'm going to tell you a story about independent central banks that will waste 3 minutes of your time. Paul Volcker wrote a book now, just written, just published, about his career. And it's typical Volcker. It's very matter of fact, very plain, no nonsense, no superb wording. And he says, I only had one occasion on which the government tried to interfere in the monetary policy decision. He said, in 1983, I received a message that the president wanted to see me at the White House. He said, I didn't know why. He says in the book he didn't know why. But I went to the White House. To my surprise, I was asked to go to the White House library, not the Oval Office as is usual. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. He said he walked in, and there was James Baker, and there was Reagan. Reagan looking very uncomfortable, said Volcker. James Baker was the president's chief of staff. He'd had every important office in the Reagan administration and the Bush administration, and he was a very good negotiator. So neither of them said anything, and then James Baker took out of his pocket a piece of paper and read it. The president orders you not to raise the interest rate before the elections. He said he didn't know what to do. He knew that was illegal. The president is not allowed to give orders to the Fed, to the chairman of the Fed. He said he couldn't figure out what to do. He just got up and walked out of the meeting. Never said a word. That's an independent central banker.
Good.
Sorry, where was I? Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, on the regulatory system. These things, how bureaucracies work is always uncertain until you actually set them to working. The British are very happy at the moment with their three tripartite structure, and they've got a lot of committees in the Bank of England dealing with separate parts of the system. And they're clearly doing good work. I mean, if you read their papers, you can see they're very, very serious. And I think that because collaboration between separate government agencies reporting to the same person, but with powers of their own, is very dangerous in a crisis. Now, in the crises, when I ask people why they're less worried about the decline in the powers of the Fed, they say because in crises people always handle the difficulties quickly. Well, when the Secretary of the Treasury and Ben Bernanke were testifying to the Congress on the money they needed to deal with the crisis, I had several of our people in the Bank of Israel watching the TV. And I said, so what happened? They said, well, nothing happened, and the two of them did not look very happy. I said, well, you know, if you needed money to deal with a crisis, and they've just told you to go away, you're not going to be very happy. Well, a week later, the Congress did change its mind. But you're playing with fire in these cases, and you don't know what the dynamics will be in a case like that. And I think it's better to have what the British have, much more detailed regulations, which involve ex-ante collaboration between the different groups.
Govindrao.
Thank you, Professor Fischer, for such a wonderful talk. My question relates to the regulation of the banks that you were referring to. You talked about the Bank of England giving up the regulation and then taking it on again after the global financial crisis. Now, with the quite a number of hybrid financial products coming into the market and banks taking over them, you do need a specialized agency to do the regulation. Otherwise, you will have multiple regulators. And when you have multiple regulators, then you have regulatory arbitrage, regulatory conflict, and then much higher compliance cost.
That's a very accurate description of the American system.
The alternative is the Australian system, where you have APRA, which basically does all the regulation, but then they have a good coordinating mechanism.
Right.
So how would you, in fact, obviously in the past everything was done by the central bank, but going further, how do you really see this?
Well, I mean, the facetious answer is get Australians to run the thing. But I'm not sure that the British would go that far, because it says something. I think that a structure somewhat like the British structure is actually much better than what we have now.
Kaushik?
Thank you very much. Fascinating lecture. I want to push you a little bit on what you sort of began with, the low interest rates across countries and not quite having the kind of effect that you would expect out of this. What I wonder, this is very much an outsider's question. When I watch these advanced economies caught in low, zero interest rate situation, one wonders whether we have entered a world where there is much more inter-central bank connectivity, causing a kind of multiple equilibria, which you later referred to in the context of Blanchard's lecture, whereby one just reads that I can't raise my interest rate now for a different reason, that the exchange rate is going to appreciate, exports will be hurt, and each country separately utters this. So one begins to wonder whether we've reached a stage of globalization where each central bank taking its own decision is causing a trap. They got into it individually, but now they are almost in a multiple equilibria, caught in a trap. So you need a collective heave somehow for them to get out of it. Do we need this? Is it at all possible?
And to add to that little thing where Kaushik ended, do you think it would be really appropriate for a more meaningful relationship in the G20 summit, in which the central bankers are able to come across a more cohesive and coherent policy?
The trouble with that sort of getting big groups together is that the more people you have in it, the harder it is to reach an agreement. And furthermore, the less power does the average member of the group have. So you've got a lot of smaller countries trying to settle the system. And of course, you all know the Charles Kindleberger argument that the international system needs a hegemon, that is, a leader or a ruler to operate effectively. And it was the British in the late 19th century and until World War I. The Americans then took over, and the Chinese are probably trying to do it now. I don't think that making the G20, look, you've seen the G20 operate. They meet in some country where all of a sudden another 5 members are invited, who are not in the G20, but they take part in the meeting. Why? Because they're friends of the country that's hosting it, and things like that. It doesn't work unless it's got a much more a much stronger constitution. That could be done, but I don't expect it'll be done soon. And every attempt at fully coordinating exchange rates has failed, whether it was fixed exchange rates or whatever else. So you get closer and closer to floating rates, or floating rates with the same target inflation rate, which is not a bad equilibrium, and it's one we have now. I think it's not an accident that trade has been less affected by all the, well, not now that we have a different theory of trade in the United States. The system isn't working as well as it was working a few years ago. And, you know, there's no controlling what the people in charge do.
Okay, Devesh.
I was wondering if you could share with us the effects on monetary policy by central banks on the rise of cryptocurrencies. How might that affect how central banks conduct monetary policy?
My sense is that if those institutions ever become important and actually have a serious impact on the amount of seigniorage that the big country central banks earn, they'll be shut down in some way or the other. I don't know about shut down, but controlled in some way or the other. There are very large sums of money. The Fed was turning $170 billion per annum over to the US Treasury in the great financial crisis. because everybody was moving into Fed notes, and the interest rates were favorable for the Fed to make a lot of money in the beginning, not later. Well, okay. Last question.
Last question.
Am I allowed to say last question? MK?
Please.
You said it, so go ahead.
Well, I think that since...
No, I think we had a last question. The person who's holding her, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for an interesting lecture. It was really great. You talked a little bit about the dangers of high debt. You know, there's this sort of issue of debt sustainability. But so India is thinking about issuing its first sovereign bond in foreign currency instead of tapping foreign markets.
Did you say Brazil?
So India.
India.
Yeah. So India's debt is currently around 68% of GDP, sovereign debt, and its external debt is something like 4 or 5% of GDP. So it's a little bit lower than some other emerging market economies. But it's sort of in the recent budget is thinking about issuing the first foreign currency denominated bond. Sort of just wondering about your thoughts on how much higher external debt should go up as a fraction of GDP in the interest of sort of debt sustainability.
Well, this is you need to ask what you need the proceeds for, and you actually have to have some people trying to calculate the benefits and costs of these things. I mean, it sort of becomes a game, and it's not a very intelligent game. We can do better than you. We got an interest rate lower than you, and so forth. And they need to more frequently be asking why. They need more reserves if that's what they're doing with the borrowing. So I don't know whether India should issue foreign currency debt. Many smaller countries do because they have no choice, and so I wouldn't want to issue an ordinance that there shall be no foreign currency borrowing. They have to grow up.
So, Stan, before you end, can I, having had the privilege of chairing the session, take the liberty of asking one thought which came to me and have your comments. Since you did mention about the Monetary Policy Committee of the Reserve Bank, which now has a parliamentary mandate to manage inflation in a particular band, and to report to Parliament if for 2 successive quarters they have failed to adhere to the target. Now that really leaves, if monetary policy is therefore tied up, that really leaves the fiscal policy part of it as an entirely sovereign decision. Now, having chaired the committee on the new Fiscal Policy Management Act, which Parliament has subsequently adopted, one of the big issues is what is the best international practice, you would suggest, in regard to the enforcement of fiscal rules? Because as far as monetary policy rules are concerned, they are obliged to report to Parliament. The one area where I could not persuade the government is to have an independent fiscal council so that one could seek greater symmetry and congruence between monetary and fiscal policy for overall macroeconomic stability. So if you had the option, how would you really want to advise a country like India on the issue of adherence to fiscal rules and fiscal policy?
The big problem in answering that question is what is there left for the Parliament to do? You've taken their monetary policy away from them, you've taken their spending policy away from them. So what are the people's representatives going to do in...
Absolutely. I think without you having participated, if I may share this is exactly what the then finance minister told me when I did try to push the button on the fiscal policy, said that give us some room, you have taken away the monetary issue, Now, on the fiscal one, you're pushing me to have a fiscal council, and it's nobody else except me who's accountable to Parliament and the room for what. But the problem with that, there are several problems. Then, if it doesn't have any mechanism for adherence to fiscal rules, but in practice.
I don't want to, NK, I don't want to be more pro-British than I am, but they have this institution run by a guy who I respect a lot because he used to write speeches for me, called Robert something. Anyway, he runs the Budgetary Responsibility Office or something of the British government. And he and Gordon Brown didn't get along well, but you know, it's hard for people to deal with people who criticize them as if they're all good buddies. But I think something like that, but you have to have respected people running that, and it's got to be advisory. I don't see how you can take over the power of the Parliament.
Absolutely. Anyway, so I think that we have more than stretched your time and patience. So it's a great pleasure for me to thank you profoundly, Stan, for a real great overview on some of the complex macroeconomic policies which confront the world and which confront India. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before we end the evening, I have a very pleasant task that I have to assign to both NK and Stan, and to also call my co-editor, Karthik, with me. We traditionally launch the volume from the previous conference at this IPF lecture, and I'm going to request Stan and NK and my co-editor to do this with us.
Thank you. Yeah, we have to show it.
It's the Christmas present approach.
Well, it looks. It looks like a Brookings volume. By some coincidence.
It is not a coincidence. It's sort of the tradition that we follow.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. And thanks for thanks for inviting me, and thanks for everything.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us tonight. And I want to thank Stan and NK Singh for conducting this evening. Please join us for dinner across the plaza in the new building. And thereafter, for those of us who are interested in cricket, who don't want to miss anything, I don't know what the state of the match is, but at 9 o'clock, it will be on the big screen here, and you can stay on and watch it for however long as it lasts. So have a good time, and thank you again. And we'll see you tomorrow at 9:30.